You know that feeling when you're having a bad day and stub your toe? Well, imagine stubbing your toe and deciding to execute your entire kitchen staff because of it. Welcome to the twisted world of history's most cruel kings, where a minor inconvenience could lead to a major massacre. Now, before you think this is just another boring history lesson, let me stop you right there. What I'm about to tell you is so shocking that Netflix's darkest true crime documentaries look like bedtime stories. Picture this. It's 1462, and you're invited to a lovely outdoor dinner party. The tables are set, the mood is perfect, and the garden is illuminated by hundreds of human torches, actual people, burning alive, used as garden decorations. This wasn't a scene from a horror movie. This was just another Tuesday for Vlad the Impaler. But hey, at least Vlad was honest about his cruelty. Some of these rulers actually thought they were the good guys. Can you imagine being so delusional that you believe bathing in virgin blood is just a normal skincare routine? Because that's exactly what Countess Elizabeth Bathory thought would keep her young forever. Did you know that one of history's most sadistic rulers became king at the tender age of 3? I'm talking about Ivan the Terrible, and trust me, that nickname wasn't given out for his terrible taste in fashion. But before we dive deeper into these blood-soaked stories, I need you to understand something crucial. Everything I'm about to tell you is historically documented. These aren't urban legends or campfire stories. These are real events that shaped our world in ways we're still dealing with today. Let's start with a king who made Game of Thrones look like a Disney movie. Ever heard of King Leopold II of Belgium? No? Well, buckle up, because this guy managed to kill over 10 million people while convincing the world he was running a charity. In the late 19th century, Leopold II created what he called the Congo Free State. Free, in this case, meant he was free to do whatever he wanted with the Congolese people. And what he wanted was rubber, lots of it. His soldiers would enter villages and demand impossible quotas of rubber collection. If the villagers failed to meet these quotas, they would have their hands chopped off. Even children weren't spared from this brutality. But here's the truly twisted part. Leopold never set foot in the Congo. Not once. He orchestrated one of history's largest genocides from the comfort of his palace in Brussels, all while presenting himself to the world as a philanthropist bringing civilization to Africa. And speaking of never visiting the places you're destroying, let me tell you about King John of England. You might know him as the bad guy from Robin Hood stories, but the reality was far worse. This is a king who was so cruel that when he imprisoned people's wives and children as hostages, he would starve them to death in his dungeons. There's a reason why, after he died, no other English king was named John. It's like how nobody names their kid Voldemort. Some names just carry too much baggage. But John's cruelty seems almost quaint compared to what we're about to discuss next. Because in our next segment, we're going to meet a ruler who made murder into an art form, literally. He would stage elaborate theatrical productions where the grand finale was always death, and attendance was mandatory. Want to know who this theatrical tyrant was? Well, you'll have to stick around for part 2. Where we'll explore how this particular king turned human suffering into a spectator sport. And trust me, what he did with just a pair of pliers and a wild imagination will make you grateful for modern human rights laws. But before we get there, let me leave you with this thought. Every single one of these rulers believed they were absolutely justified in their actions. They didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as visionaries, as great leaders, as people who were simply doing what needed to be done. And perhaps that's the scariest part of all. The fact that some of history's greatest monsters went to sleep each night believing they were the heroes of their own stories. Part 2. The Theater of Pain. Now, remember that theatrical tyrant I mentioned? Let me introduce you to Nero, the Roman emperor who took the phrase, "dying for your art," way too literally. Picture an ancient Roman version of Broadway, except the special effects were real. The deaths weren't staged, and the director was a murderous emperor with a god complex. Nero had this peculiar habit of turning executions into elaborate theatrical productions. Imagine being sentenced to death and finding out you're going to play Icarus in his latest show. The twist? You're actually going to be launched from a real cliff. Talk about method acting. But Nero's artistic vision didn't stop there. He once threw a party where he had Christians covered in wax and set on fire to serve as human candles. And here's the kicker. He would stroll through his gardens, enjoying the ambience while hosting dinner parties. Talk about a mood-lighting fail. Speaking of failed dinner parties, let's talk about Wu Zetian, China's only female emperor. She had this charming habit of inviting political rivals to banquets where the main course was watching their own family members being executed. Now, that's what I call dinner theater. Wu Zetian started her career as a concubine and worked her way up to absolute power through a combination of political genius and absolutely ruthless violence. She invented a new form of torture called the human pig, where victims would have their hands and feet chopped off, their face peeled away, and then be force-fed their own flesh. And you thought your office politics were brutal, but at least Wu Zetian was efficient in her cruelty. The same can't be said for King Herod the Great, who was about as great at being a king as I am at underwater basket weaving. Herod was so paranoid about losing his power that he executed his wife, 3 of his sons, his mother-in-law, and countless others. He even ordered that all the noble families of Jerusalem should be executed upon his death, so that people would cry at his funeral. Talk about desperate for attention. Now, let me tell you about a king who makes Herod look like a reasonable guy. Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad. And boy, did he earn that nickname. Charles became convinced that he was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. He had his tailors make special reinforced clothing and wouldn't let anyone touch him. But here's the truly wild part. During his lucid moments, he was still ordering executions and tortures like it was going out of style. But perhaps the most disturbing thing about Charles wasn't his glass delusion. It was his occasional moments of clarity when he would realize what he had done. Imagine waking up from a mental breakdown to discover you'd ordered the death of hundreds of innocent people. That's the kind of thing that would drive anyone mad. Speaking of madness, let's talk about Sultan Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire, nicknamed Ibrahim the Mad. This guy makes Charles VI look like a picture of mental health. Ibrahim had all the fur-bearing animals in his empire drown because one of his concubines told him she thought fur was prettier on living animals. He also ordered his entire harem of 280 women to be tied in weighted sacks and dropped into the Bosphorus Strait because he thought one of them might have been unfaithful. Talk about an overreaction. But perhaps the most bizarre aspect of Ibrahim's reign was his obsession with obesity. He believed that the fatter a woman was, the more beautiful she was. He once sent his agents throughout the empire to find the fattest woman they could. When they found her, a 330-pound Armenian woman, he made her governor of Damascus. Finally, a positive discrimination story from history. Sort of. But before you start thinking that all these rulers were obviously insane, let me introduce you to our next segment star, a king who was terrifyingly sane. Part 3. The Science of Suffering. Remember when I promised you a ruler who turned cruelty into a science? Well, meet King Philip II of Spain, the original micromanager of mayhem. You think your boss is bad with their endless spreadsheets? Philip II created an entire bureaucratic system just to track torture and executions during the Spanish Inquisition. This guy would receive detailed reports about every single torture session, complete with victim reactions and efficiency ratings. Talk about performance metrics. But here's the truly chilling part. Philip didn't do this out of sadistic pleasure. No, he genuinely believed he was saving souls by burning bodies. He would actually pray for the people he was torturing. Now, that's what I call toxic positivity. Speaking of twisted logic, let's talk about Tamerlane, the ruler who took building monuments to a whole new level. When this cheerful fellow conquered a city, he would build pyramids, not of stone, but of human skulls. We're talking about towers made from the heads of up to 90,000 people. Makes your Lego collection seems a bit tame, doesn't it? Tamerlane once executed 70,000 people in Isfahan just to make a point. The point? Don't mess with Tamerlane. Message received? I'd say he was so feared that some cities would commit mass suicide rather than face his armies. Now, that's what you call an intimidating personal brand. But at least Tamerlane was upfront about his cruelty. Let me tell you about Ranavalona I of Madagascar, who killed half her country's population while convinced she was being a great ruler. Ranavalona had this charming habit of testing people's loyalty through tangina, a poison ordeal where you had to swallow 3 pieces of chicken skin and a poison that would make you vomit. If you didn't throw up all 3 pieces, you were considered guilty of disloyalty and executed. Talk about a tough performance review. Under her rule, Madagascar's population dropped from 5 million to 2.5 million. Yet she insisted she was protecting traditional values. Imagine killing half your population and still thinking you deserve a world's best boss mug. Now, let's meet someone who makes Ranavalona look like an amateur. King Afonso I of the Kingdom of Congo. This guy took family drama to unprecedented levels. Afonso became king by defeating his brother in battle, which isn't too unusual for medieval times. What made him special was his approach to family planning. He executed not just his brother, but every male relative who might possibly have a claim to the throne. Then he executed their families, then their friends, then people who had once waved at them in the street. But here's the real kicker. Afonso presented himself as a devout Christian king, writing lengthy letters to the Pope about his spiritual journey, while simultaneously ordering mass executions. Talk about work-life balance. Speaking of religious hypocrisy, let's discuss Henry VIII of England. Now, you might think you know this story. Man wants divorce, man creates new church, man goes through wives like tissue paper. But the reality was so much worse. Henry didn't just execute 2 of his wives. He created an entire system of legal murder. He would have Parliament pass laws making specific thoughts treasonous, then execute people for thoughts they had before the law existed. That's like your teacher giving you an F for not doing homework they assigned yesterday for last week. But perhaps the most terrifying thing about Henry VIII wasn't his actions. It was how he normalized them. He turned execution into a public spectacle, complete with souvenirs and refreshment stands. People would pack picnics to watch beheadings. It was like a medieval Super Bowl, except with more head rolling and less commercial breaks. And speaking of commercializing cruelty, wait until you hear about our next ruler. Part 4, the business of brutality. Remember when I mentioned a king who turned torture into a business model? Well, meet Christian II of Denmark, the original entrepreneur of evil. You think today's billionaires are ruthless? Christian II created a monopoly on human suffering. He would arrest wealthy citizens on false charges, torture them until they revealed their assets, then seize everything they owned. It was like a medieval version of insider trading, except with more thumbscrews. The truly ingenious part? He hired German bankers to manage this operation, creating the world's first torture-backed securities. These bankers would advance him money based on expected confessions. Talk about predatory lending. But Christian II wasn't content with just financial innovation. He became famous for something called the Stockholm Bloodbath. No, it wasn't a heavy metal concert. It was a 3-day festival of execution where he invited all of Sweden's nobility to a coronation celebration, then systematically executed them. Speaking of party fouls, let's talk about Basil II of the Byzantine Empire, nicknamed the Bulgar Slayer. Now there's a LinkedIn title you don't see every day. After winning a battle against 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers, Basil decided that killing them would be too merciful. Instead, he had them all blinded, except for one in every 100 men, who kept one eye so they could lead their comrades home. Imagine 14,850 blind men being led by 150 one-eyed men back to their king. That's what I call a visual statement. But at least Basil was creative. Let me tell you about King Richard II of England, who took death by chocolate way too literally. Richard had a special execution method for people who annoyed him. He would force feed them sweets until they died. His own uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, met his end this way. Talk about death by dessert. Now, if you thought Richard Sweettooth was bad, wait until you hear about Zhu Hozhao, the Jing Emperor of China. This guy turned the phrase, living your best life, into a horror show. Zhu would host elaborate parties where he would force his courtiers to pretend they were shopkeepers in a fake city he built inside his palace. Anyone who broke character would be executed on the spot. It was like a deadly version of medieval times dinner theater. But here's the truly bizarre part. He would sometimes forget he wasn't actually a shopkeeper and try to arrest real government officials for impersonating the emperor. Imagine being executed because your emperor was having a method-acting moment. Speaking of identity crises, let's discuss Peter III of Russia, who managed to be both terrifyingly cruel and ridiculously incompetent at the same time. Peter had a special love for military drills, but instead of using soldiers, he would force his pet dogs to perform them. These dogs were dressed in military uniforms and hung if they failed to execute commands properly. Yes, you heard that right. He court-martialed dogs. But Peter's reign of terror comedy didn't last long. His wife, Catherine the Great, orchestrated a coup and had him assassinated. I guess you could say his bark was worse than his bite. And speaking of pets, wait until you hear about our next ruler, a king whose love for animals was matched only by his hatred for humans. Part 5. When Love Meets Hate, the final chapter. And now, for the grand finale, let me introduce you to Frederick the Great of Prussia's father, Friedrich Wilhelm I, also known as the Soldier King. Remember that weird kid in school who was obsessed with collecting something? Well, Friedrich Wilhelm collected tall soldiers. And when I say collected, I mean he literally kidnapped tall people from across Europe to serve in his Potsdam Giants regiment. These soldiers weren't allowed to fight. They were just for show, like human garden gnomes, except 7 feet tall and thoroughly miserable. If you were over 6 feet tall in 18th century Europe, you lived in constant fear of being kidnapped by Prussia's height-obsessed king. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. While Friedrich Wilhelm was spending fortunes collecting tall men, he was also one of the most frugal kings in history. He would beat his servants if they used too much candlelight and forced his children to eat nothing but bread and vegetables. Talk about mixed financial priorities. Speaking of priorities, let's talk about Emperor Yang of Sui, who took infrastructure projects to a whole new level of insanity. Yang forced millions of workers to build a massive canal system. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, he also insisted that the workers continue during winter. When they started dying from the cold, he ordered their bodies to be mixed into the cement. Talk about being dedicated to your job. But here's the truly ironic part. Yang was so obsessed with the canal project that he neglected his army. When rebels finally came for him, he tried to escape using the very canals that had killed so many of his people. Spoiler alert, it didn't work out well for him. Now, let me introduce you to the grand champion of paradoxical cruelty, King Louis XV of France, who managed to be simultaneously the most caring and most callous ruler in French history. Louis created Europe's first public health system and pioneered animal protection laws. Awesome, right? Well, at the same time, he was running something called the Secret du Roi, a network of spies and assassins who would eliminate anyone who spoke against him. He literally pioneered healthcare while running a murder-for-hire business on the side. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Louis's reign wasn't his actions. It was his absolute conviction that he was doing God's work. He would attend Mass every morning, pray for hours, and then go sign death warrants over breakfast. Talk about compartmentalization. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of our journey through history's Hall of Royal Horrors. What have we learned? Well, for one thing, power doesn't just corrupt, it gets creative about it. These weren't just cruel people who happened to be kings. They were cruel precisely because they were kings. Because when you give someone absolute power, you also give them the ability to redefine right and wrong, good and evil, sanity and madness. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. Because while we might not have absolute monarchs anymore, we still have people in positions of power. And the mechanisms that turn these rulers into monsters, the yes men, the bureaucracy, the ability to distance yourself from the consequences of your actions, those haven't gone anywhere. So next time you hear someone say, power corrupts, remember these stories. Remember that behind every cruel leader were thousands of ordinary people who helped make that cruelty possible. And remember that the only thing more dangerous than a person with too much power is a person with too much power who thinks they're doing the right thing. Because in the end, the scariest thing about all these rulers isn't that they were monsters. It's that they were human beings, just like us. And that means that under the right circumstances, with the right amount of power and the wrong amount of accountability, anyone could become the star of the next episode of history's cruelest kings. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, if you ever find yourself in a position of power, try not to collect tall people or execute dogs for poor military performance. It's generally frowned upon,